Welcome to the CEC report. It's September the 7th and I'm Elisa Barwick and I'm joined here today by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
Today we're going to be talking about three topics. A world war today would be unsurvivable. Bank of England calls for Glass-Steagall. And is Gillard perpetuating Keating's vision for Australia as the Wall Street Down Under? Now, firstly, we're going to talk about the war front again, but I want to take a step back for a moment, Craig, because many of our viewers that haven't read much CEC material would be wondering, how is it even possible? You know, everything seems to be going on day by day, business as usual. How is it even possible that we're on the verge of potential thermonuclear World War III right now?
And that would come as a bit of a shock to people, Elisa, because most people don't see this on the news and they take their opinions from the news, and the news has been very silent. What it hasn't been silent about is what's going on in Syria and Iran right now. And what you're seeing in Syria is actually the development of a new policy that's actually overtaken a policy that's been in action for over 400 years. See, prior to basically about 1999, before Britain and the US went into Kosovo, there was a principle standing called what we call the Treaty of Westphalia. And this is a principle which actually represents the concept of national sovereignty, that sovereign nation states exist as sovereign, and they are to exist amongst a community of nations, such that the interests of your neighbour or the interests of another state, nation state, is in your own interest. It's a bit like if you look at a family. I mean, you don't go to war with your own, your own sons and daughters, right? You always look out for their interests. Well, that's the sort of approach that used to be taken under this concept of the Treaty of Westphalia. And it came about 400 years ago because you had a lot of warring states within Europe, and Cardinal Mazarin at that particular time developed this concept and was able to get this concept implemented amongst a whole lot of these warring nation states. So that's the first thing. There's been a deliberate overturning of this policy. But why? Why was this policy overturned? Well, the problem is that we still have on the face of this planet a large empire. It's called the British Empire. Now, most people say, oh, but the British Empire doesn't exist anymore. You know, it used to be, back in the 19th century, a very powerful institution. And it was. You used to see it in the form of gunboats, and it used to promote the slave trading and that sort of thing. The problem is that that empire, basically after the 1960s, morphed into the British Commonwealth. And today what we see is not the gunboats and the redcoats enforcing British Empire policies. What we see is a global financial empire, a global system of monetarism, globalisation by another name. Now, what we have in the world right now is in Western Europe, you have what we call the transatlantic area. You have the collapse of places like Greece, Spain, Ireland, Iceland and so forth. In other words, the British Empire's monetary system is collapsing. And the problem for them and the problem for us is that there is a resistance to this, a natural resistance that's coming from Russia under Putin, who stands for this idea of the Treaty of Westphalia. It's actually called the Putin Doctrine. And what you see is that there's a faction within the British Empire, particularly elaborated by the likes of Prince Philip, and there's other people who have elaborated this policy, that actually think the world's overpopulated and want to reduce the world's population down to below 1 billion people. So with the British Empire's financial system disintegrating, there's a faction that we'll talk about in a minute that wants to go back to Glass-Steagall, but there's also a faction that says, we don't care if we blow up the entire world, we are going to maintain our financial power. So consequently, you have alliances with Syria and Russia, Iran and Russia, and you have China also working alongside Russia. So any attacks to destroy Syria, as we've seen in this post-Westphalian period with the destruction of Iraq, destruction of Libya, and so forth, is going to immediately invoke Russia. And consequently, this won't be just a normal war. This will be a thermonuclear war.
And this is why Russia and China have been emphatic that they will defend the sovereignty of these nations. The United Nations policy still today, under Section 2.4 of the UN Charter, states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. So that is still international law today. However, what this British faction are trying to shift it to was put very clearly back in 1946 by Bertrand Russell, another of these key British thinkers, a philosopher and mathematician. And he was part of the launching with Winston Churchill of the Cold War, starting in 1946. And it made it very clear that the reason that they had deployed the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki a year earlier was to demonstrate the horrifying power that would be deployed against you if you resisted world government. And what Russell actually said was that there is only one way in which great wars can be permanently prevented, and that is the establishment of an international government with a monopoly of serious armed force. So he said that force has to have all of the military power, all of the access to raw materials such as uranium, etc., and that any attempt to obstruct that force from coming and inspecting you to make sure that you're not developing your own weapons would be seen as a cause for war, a casus belli.
And he was talking about that in the context of an international one world government, which has been a favourite theme of these guys, such that all national sovereignty is ceded to this international power, of which, of course, the British and the Bertrand Russell faction would actually dominate.
Exactly right. Now, of course, today, any war would necessarily result in the deployment of thermonuclear weapons well beyond what we saw in Japan in 1945. And LaRouche PAC has put out a new video on this called Unsurvivable, which you can go to the LPAC website and watch. But give us a bit of a key to what's in this, Craig.
Well, the video maps out why the world would be unsurvivable after a thermonuclear attack. And the reason is that the use of nuclear weapons is not just, dropping one weapon here or one weapon there, one nuclear bomb here or one nuclear bomb there. The design of this sort of war is that you've got to go all out to start with. Now, the benchmark for this is actually Hiroshima, where the bomb drop there was only 15 kilotons, that's 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent. The world's arsenal today is 333,000 times greater. And the problem is that if you only had a regional war where, and the figures are something like 0.3% of that arsenal was deployed, or approximately 1,000 Hiroshimas, this will kick up so much dust into the atmosphere that could easily lower the temperature. Dust and black carbon would easily lower the temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius. If you had a major conflict, then you would see the world's temperature drop by about up to 7 degrees. So Alicia, you get the point with this population reduction taking place, that this is a huge threat to humanity. To give some other scale, some relative scale of what this means, is that the last ice age from 18,000 years ago the temperature drop was 5 degrees. So we're looking about a change in world climate under so-called nuclear exchanges like this that have an incredible effect on the world's ability to produce food. And this would be instantaneous, it would be long-lasting with the amount of dust that is kicked up into the atmosphere. You're not talking about a short-term effect, you're talking about a very long period of time. And consequently, this is why it would be unsurvivable.
Now, there is an alternative to this idea of mutually assured destruction, and that is what LaRouche put forward in 1983, which was adopted by Ronald Reagan, the Strategic Defence Initiative, and which wasn't actually accepted at the time. It didn't become a prevailing doctrine, which is why we're in the mess that we're in. However, the Russians have started to talk about this proposal again today under a different framework. Can you give us a bit of an idea of
Well,
that?
I was talking about the Treaty of Westphalia earlier in this segment, where the advantage, what we call the advantage of the other, or a nation states looks to the advantage of developing its neighbour in order to provide not only security for itself, but the benefits for itself. In 1983, LaRouche proposed, and it was adopted by Reagan, that the US and Russia collaborate around the development of new physical principles in science and technology to make nuclear weapons obsolete. And those discoveries of scientific principles would then come back into the domestic economy to help support Russia develop its economy at that point, but also the whole world. And that's the whole principle of the Treaty of Westphalia, the development of the benefit of the other. How unfortunately that was declined by Andropov, and the whole proposal fell apart. But it did change the strategic way the world functioned after that point, because Russia moved on to try and build many more weapons, and in the end, as LaRouche forecast in 1985, that the entire Soviet system would collapse, and it did come to pass in 1989, as we know. That idea is still being brought to life today with the Russian proposal for the strategic defence of Earth, where there be a crash program to develop the ability to deal with the great threats that are coming upon the Earth from the fact that we exist in a very hostile galaxy. We have millions of asteroids, anything from a couple of metres across to many kilometres across, that have struck the Earth in the past. And there's no way that we can actually survive some of these asteroids striking the Earth unless we develop right now methods to deal with large comets, large asteroids hitting the Earth. So the Russians have proposed that there be this sort of development of new principles to deal with these sorts of real catastrophic, potentially catastrophic events. And there's a lot more about this on the LPAC website that they constantly talk about. And
yeah, we see the potential unleashed by the Curiosity mission to begin to put our eyes and ears up on Mars to detect these threats and so forth. But of course we have to, in order to get this going, we have to immediately defuse the threat of thermonuclear war, and with Obama in the White House, that is a problem. In 1983 actually, at a conference in Erice, Italy, discussing the SDI, the Italian physicist Antonino Zacchichi actually said that somewhere down the track, in maybe 10 years, 100 years, a fool would come along who would have the finger on the button and would deploy thermonuclear weapons. And of course, there's no going back at that point. So developing this defence concept where any thermonuclear weapon can be immediately destroyed by laser beam technology, etc., that is crucial. That's all we've got time for to discuss in this segment. Join us after the break. Welcome back. Now we're going to look at the second topic, Bank of England calls for Glass-Steagall. Now just this week, in fact in the last 24 hours, we've been hearing about new European Central Bank plans to buy up virtually unlimited amounts of government bonds from the struggling nations in Europe to keep them going. We've been getting reports from Europe everywhere that there are exit strategies, companies, business consultancies preparing 300-page studies giving to governments advice on what will happen when the euro ends. The big players in banks and governments are also beginning to take their liquidity out of Europe so that their derivatives and securities are not exposed. This is causing all manner of problems. Every night the banks are withdrawing everything from foreign banks in these European nations so that they're not exposed. And the European Commission is essentially proposing a full bankers' dictatorship where all regulations of the banks in exchange for these bailouts would be handled by the supranational authorities. Now, in contrast to that, because that's part of really what brought us to this point.
Actually, in contrast to that, nothing happens. There's no news on our news down here about any of that.
Yeah, no, exactly, which is why we're on.
Yes.
But in contrast to that, in the United States, there was a meeting of international central bankers at Jackson Hole in Wyoming, and one of the top directors actually of the Bank of England, by the name of Andrew Haldane, has made a very interesting speech calling for a return to Glass-Steagall.
Yeah.
And the speech was called, I
the
believe...
dog and the frisbee of all things. Mm. And the principle of it, it's a really quite a fascinating speech, because look, this is the Bank of England, one of the first banks in the world to be set up, one of the premier banks of the British Empire. You have an executive officer saying, we've got to have Glass-Steagall. And essentially what he is saying is that the banking system has become so complex that any type of complex regulation is simply not going to work. It's going to basically create more instability. And the title of his speech was The Dog and the Frisbee, because he says when a dog basically catches a frisbee, it doesn't even think about the laws of gravity, it just catches the frisbee. So banking legislation has to be that simple. And what you've seen from the past period of regulation in the banking system is a process of as he says, thou shalt not. So the regulation's been based upon thou shalt not. The Glass-Steagall legislation that was brought in by Franklin Roosevelt was only 36 pages long, but it was basically thou shalt not have banks that are mixed up with commercial banks and trading banks or merchant banks. Thou shalt not have insurance companies involved with those. They shall not have stockbroking houses. So that they have to be basically pure banking, commercial banking entities. So it was very simple legislation. Today's legislation, like Basel III and so forth, now runs into 60,000 pages or more because it's thou shalt. In other words, you can do this, but. You can do this, but.
They could sum it up in 3 words, you can do anything, or however.
And the problem is that this creates huge complex problems which, of course, can't ever be solved. So what Andrew Haldane is saying is we need Glass-Steagall because, one, it's been on the books. It was on the books for 70 years. It worked, right? And it was simple. So just like a dog catching a frisbee, that's how simple the banking re-regulations have to be. And this is really quite a substantial statement on his behalf because it actually reflects the truth.
Yeah, he stated in his conclusion, he said, modern finance is complex, perhaps too complex. Regulation of modern finance is complex, almost certainly too complex. That configuration spells trouble. As you do not fight fire with fire, you do not fight complexity with complexity, because complexity generates uncertainty, not risk. It requires a regulatory response grounded in simplicity, not complexity. Delivering that would require an about turn from the regulatory community from the path followed for the better part of the past 50 years. If a once-in-a-lifetime crisis is not able to deliver that change, it is not clear what will. To ask today's regulators to save us from tomorrow's crisis using yesterday's toolbox is to ask a border collie to catch a frisbee by first applying Newton's law of gravity.
It's pretty simple.
That's right.
That's what we've been saying all along. That's why if people want more information, they can go to our website on what Glass-Steagall is and particularly look at what our proposals are for a solution. First of all, you have to have Glass-Steagall to rein in the huge amount of speculative debt in the system. You can't solve the $1.4 quadrillion worth of speculative debt that is floating around. There is no solutions for Europe. There is no regulation or buying up loans and so forth by the ECU that's going to work. And the sooner we recognise that that's the reality, like Andrew Haldane has, and actually approach and put those laws in, then we can actually solve the world's financial system problems.
So take this idea to your politician and make sure they know about it. So we'll join you back after the break. Welcome back. Our last topic for discussion today is Gillard perpetuating Keating's vision for Australia as the Wall Street Down Under? Now, in her recent speech on education, which I'm sure many of you have seen this week, Julia Gillard said that we must compete in terms of our level of education with foreign countries. Now, this is quite a mystifying concept if you really think about it, because why on earth, to have a good education for our children, do we have to compete in some global market or something? And in fact, what they're insinuating here is that we're having to compete for international capital and investment. We have to make ourselves an attractive investment prospect in order to bring in the sort of capital that we need to build our country. I won't say develop our country, they're not really interested in that, but really just to sustain our economy, we need bucket loads of money flowing in. So education has been really put into that category. But there really are other ways of creating that investment. And we put out a press release on this just yesterday, Craig, which discussed the types of nation-building jobs that we need, as opposed to, Gillard had a whole section of her speech, and she talked about it on ABC Radio, where she said that her parents, for example, could have been professionals if they had been better educated. So I thought, well, I didn't think her parents were, just lowly cleaners or something. So I looked it up, and it turns out her father was a psychiatric nurse. Her mother did nursing at a Salvation Army nursing home. These are crucial jobs. So what is she talking about here? Does she want to turn us all into paper pushers? And I mean, Keating's idea was that Australia would be the Wall Street of the South, and hence we would be a financial capital for inflows and outflows of money. So is this a Labor Prime Minister turning away from the working class here?
Well, he not only had the idea of being the financial centre of the Wall Street of the South, but he had the idea that Australia should just be basically a mining export nation. So you shut down all actual manufacturing capabilities, shut down the family farms, and just become a mining centre. Now, I put a press release out this week. Shrinking billionaires are the canaries in the mine. This is the analogy where you put a canary in the mine, and if the canary dies, you know there's toxic gases, usually carbon monoxide, in the gas, and it's dangerous for workers. Well, why are they the canaries, these billionaires? Well, the fact is that their actual wealth has been a complete myth. And right now, if you take, for example, the wealth of Gina Rinehart, or at 9.5 billion so-called, or Twiggy Forrest at 2.2 billion, it's all based upon the hyperinflated values of commodities. Take, for example, iron ore. It's gone down from $140 a tonne to below $90 a tonne. So this so-called wealth of our billionaires has basically evaporated. You've seen whole projects now shut down, like the Olympic Dam program in South Australia, based on the fact that commodity prices are falling through the floor. This is going to mean a flow-on. We lose a lot of jobs in these sectors and flow-on jobs associated with these sectors. What does that mean for Australia? It means basically, we become a shell of what we're capable of doing. You see in Victoria, particularly in other parts of the country, the loss of manufacturing workers has been staggering because we've decided to play this game, the so-called fake wealth game of going along with the mining boom. And that's finished. So the only way that we can really deal with this now is to launch a massive infrastructure development projects. We need to build things like the high-speed magnetic levitation train system from Melbourne to Darwin and then back down to Perth. We need to build water projects like the Bradfield scheme, the Clarence River scheme in particular. These will provide vast amounts of water for the Murray-Darling system. The Murray-Darling system needs extra water. We can provide it if you invest in real infrastructure development. And this means that you're going to have large numbers of blue-collar workers. You're going to have to require, which means you can employ more people and allow them to develop themselves. These will be high-paid jobs. These won't be just meaningful make-work jobs. So this is the directionality that our country has to go. We need a large-scale infrastructure development project commitment to that, and we need to fund this all through national banking, which we've talked about on past shows.
And that's really going to drive, in fact, an education boom with the CRASH program to train countless numbers of engineers, nuclear scientists.
It'll develop whole new areas like electromagnetic dynamic engineers, whole new areas that we can develop that way, based on real things.
That's right, and education in that sense has very little to do with competing with any other nation, but in fact far more to do in the Treaty of Westphalia spirit with the cooperation
of other nations,
working to help other nations build themselves as well, the rising tide lifts all boat ideas. And only that, looking at the welfare of our nation and focusing on that reality as well as our neighbours, is going to drive the kind of shift in education that we actually need.
That's right.
So we have to focus on that. Now, there's plenty more we could say. We have to stop there today. So look at our website, call the toll-free number up on your screen, and we'll send you some free literature. But join us again next week. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.